Excellent. Right, well, thanks for continuing to turn up promptly. So, I can understand why some people have chosen to stay in bed this morning. This is potentially the dullest of the lectures. And yet, it's something that the industry feels is very, very important for you to know about right from the off. And they feel that the bad press it gets and the sort of withering looks is unjustified, and really, somehow or another, schools of architecture should do much more to try and talk about these things earlier. It's a big issue in practice, there's no question about that, and mistakes and problems can be both expensive to you personally because you cannot insure against the sorts of fines that will be imposed, so they'll come out of your pocket, and also emotionally. If something terrible was to happen on a building site and it was partly your fault, you know, you would feel pretty bad about that. So it's a sort of serious issue. And in this talk, I'm just going to try and let you see the framework. There are, unfortunately, questions on this in the exam. The questions are very much to do with your awareness of the problem. They're not super technical questions, but there is an expectation that you have an awareness of how health and safety works. Our guest today is Stuart Crowe. Now, I don't really know Stuart that well, but he's very senior in the university here. He is meant to oversee all sorts of health and safety things, so I've come across him once or twice. We'll just have to see. In an ideal world, I would have brought my wife's cousin. And I have actually had him, not at this lecture, but I've had him talking to my MArch students. It's difficult, these lectures, because they're taped. So that means I have to be really careful about what I say. I can't believe, I give lectures all over the country, which are not on any sort of vital. And I found one of them somehow or another on the internet. I just can't believe it. When I searched a particular topic, up popped my lecture. So this is a real problem, and it means that I can't be quite as candid or I don't know what the word is, lively as I might be if these things weren't taped. But I am going to tell you about this guy who works for a construction company in the Midlands. And he has to give talks on health and safety within his company. And it's quite a big company. And he starts the talk off with a video. And the video is of a construction site. And it's the usual thing with lots of stuff going on and, you know, vehicles moving around and a load of stuff piled up over there and the start of a steel frame going up over here and there's mud and usual, you can imagine the scenario. And a vehicle, which is basically one of those large digger things. He has a technical name for it, I don't know what it is. And this thing has a sort of, it's on Caterpillar tracks, but the body of the thing is wider than the Caterpillar tracks. And on the video, there's a guy walking along a wall, a brick wall of an existing building, and this machine basically is on a sort of trajectory like this, and he basically crushes the guy to death on the video. In the steward's inquiry that followed from that, the people who reviewed it felt that the team had not thought carefully about the organisation of that site, the clear demarcation of who was supposed to be able to walk where, and that the guy driving the digger knew that he was only meant to stay in certain places, or at certain times he would have a ganger. A ganger is someone who directs the thing, a bit like a policeman, saying, yeah, you're okay to go. It trickled all the way to the architect and the client because it was works adjacent to an existing building. And they started interrogating what had that team thought up front about how these construction works would take place next to the existing building. Now, it was actually a construction worker who was killed, not a member of the staff of the company. But nevertheless, can you imagine being part of that steward's inquiry? Can you imagine having been the guy who was driving the digger, or indeed the family members of the guy who was crushed to death? Now, I did actually ask if I could have this video, and he basically said, obviously, the company don't want to release it because it's incredibly bad press for them. They don't mind using it for training purposes within their organisation, but they weren't prepared to make it available. But it's at that extreme end of a series of strange decisions that were made, a lack of thought considered, that result in a disaster. And it's that sort of stuff which sadly is the end of all this boring audit trail. So, we're going to have a little intro. We're going to talk about the health and safety framework, which is important you sort of understand the basics. We're going to talk about the Health and Safety of Work Act because it's a sort of umbrella piece of legislation under which everything else fits. We're then going to talk about the CDM regs. So now, if you don't remember anything else today, there's about 3 things you mustn't forget, and one of them is that. CDM regs, that's like the Bible for us architects and anybody in the construction industry. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about risk assessments, which it's quite possible you'll get involved in your year out. We'll see. But it's certainly something you need to understand. It's more than just a paper chase. That's where we are. Just over halfway through. Next week it's procurement. And we've got Stuart joining us, I hope, today. So, health and safety is a significant part of what we do as architects. Whether you're in a big practice or a little practice, it's sort of always got to be thought about. It's something that's always kicking around. Of course, it's easy, as you're walking in this morning thinking, oh my God, a lecture on health and safety, Everything's fine, of course, until it goes wrong. It's like anything to do with insurance. If you go on holiday and you don't bother with holiday insurance and you think, oh, I was clever there, I'll save myself 30 quid. But of course, if something goes wrong and you have to be flown home, it's serious stuff. You are personally liable under certain circumstances if something goes wrong, because the fines, these are criminal offences, and so the fines which are imposed are personal fines. So, in the profession, not just with you guys, everybody going, my God, got to fill in that risk assessment. And so, over the years, it's become a sort of stupid checklist thing where people have got pre-prepared things with all like items 1 to 20 on them and a whole load of stuff about dust and trips and blah, 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 and you sort of tick them. So, it's also seen as a defensive exercise. So you're trying to make sure you don't get into trouble and you don't get blamed for anything. Even in the profession, even with experienced architects, there's a concern that it's a mass of impenetrable legislation which you couldn't possibly know. So a lot of people, what they do is they go and employ an expert. We'll employ an expert to do this job. We won't try and do it ourselves. And that's not necessarily such a clever way to go about things. What happened was, in 2015, which isn't that long ago, is it? The health and safety clocked all this, because they're not stupid, and they go around loads of building sites, and they go loads of architects' offices, and they gathered that everybody thinks this is like a joke and a waste of time. So they changed the whole way in which health and safety is done in 2015, and they tried to make it more straightforward, because they thought to themselves, you guys, as architects, in the centre of the team, which you've learned all about that from everybody, you honestly do know most of what's going on. You do know what the structural engineer's problems are. You do know about that M&E guy, and he's got to get his ducts across here, or he's got to put something on the roof really late on, it's going to get craned in. You also know about the client. If you're doing a refurbishment job, you know that they're still using those 3 classrooms for children. And so they clocked that the architect is in a really, really good position to think about these from a practical point of view. So they swapped everything around. They invented a term called principal designer, and they put you at the centre of it. But what they said is, listen, just think about all the big things that can go wrong. Think about all the obvious things. Try not to think about the ridiculous, peculiar set of scenarios that might result in somebody ending up, banging their finger on a thing when a door shuts or something. Just think about the big things, and then we'll have covered 90% of it, and that'll be tons better than what we get now, which is a load of checklists. So, the message is that you need to be aware of the framework, so you need to know where to look. You need to use these design risk assessments, which we're going to talk about, as a proactive tool to communicate with other people, and then when you've done them, you need to make sure the message gets out there to the structural engineer, to the contractor, to whoever it is who's going to be involved, so that they actually take note of what you're doing. So, start off with a bit of statistics for you. The workforce in the UK represents 6.7% of GDP, so that's an awful lot of money. 450,000 professionals involved across the country, and 1.7 million site workers. And as you can imagine, whether you're from the UK, China, wherever, a lot of these guys and ladies are not necessarily that qualified. Some of them are definitely paid from the neck down. So how are you going to make sure that they're aware of what's what? The government sussed that there's a disproportionately high level of accidents in the construction industry compared to other industries like car building or the steelworks. So they thought, whoa, we need to look at this. It's not good enough, the way it works. Some more statistics, and sadly for you, some of this crops up in the exam, but it's only just what's the obvious message there. Statistics in the construction industry, over half are falls from height. Okay, so what you do, you have to make sure there's a barrier, you have to make sure people are instructed, etc, etc, etc. Then there's a sort of minority of other things there. In terms of serious injuries, so people like me injuring their spine or killing themselves, a third are falls from height. So we know that if you're doing a risk assessment, you're going to take a lot of trouble to make sure that falls from height are minimised. But in the serious injury category, there's also things to do with trips. There's stuff to do with moving vehicles. That's like my story I've just told you. That was to do with moving vehicles. Handling, that's to do with lifting very heavy things sometimes, and you damage your back or whatever. So, falls from height, big problem. So this is the framework which you need to sort of be aware of. In the UK, there's this sort of umbrella piece of legislation called the Health and Safety at Work Act, which you certainly don't need to understand in detail. You just need to understand that underneath that comes all these other things which happen in the UK. The Construction Design and Management Regs 2015, this is the thing you do need to know about, and we're going to go into a little bit of detail, and once you get in practice, you will need to know a bit more about it. But if you do manage to take an interest and swat up on this and actually know a bit about it by the time the exam comes, trust me, you'll be doing a lot better than some of my M-Arch students who also don't seem to know much about it. So it's not as though it's just UBA students who are a bit ignorant. It's like ignorance across the whole of the sort of School of Architecture, including some academic stuff. Then there's building regs, which we'll come on to in another lecture, which covers all sorts of things to do with construction, structure, etc., but incidentally covers things to do with health and safety. There's other bits and pieces, which I'm only going to mention briefly. The Regulatory Reform Act is all to do with fire safety, means of escape, etc. Management of health and safety at work. This is people involved in construction activities, so that's the sort of thing that an actual contractor would be interested in. And then finally, that last one, that's to do with any old workplace where it's expected to be safe for you. So if you're working, behind the bar at, the Zanzibar Club or something, then they're meant to make sure that it's not risky for you to go and get a load of barrels from the basement or whatever it is. So I'm going to say just a tiny little bit about the Health and Safety at Work Act, because it applies to all workplaces. Oh, hi Stuart, how are you doing? Good to see you. So I'm just going to get to the end of this one slide, and then we'll do it. But if you want to perch yourself over there, that's great, thank you. Yeah, so the reason I'm mentioning Health and Safety at Work Act is there's sort of three levels of stuff in all of this legislation. One is shall or must, where you've got to do something. It's not a debate, you've got to do it. Then there's as far as is practicable. So we'll come on to risk assessments in the moment. And if you can achieve this particular thing, you've got to do it. And then there's so far as is reasonably practicable. So this is, you're going to do a risk assessment. And if it's incredibly unlikely that scenario would ever happen, well, you can take a view on it and go forward and say, all right, well, we'll leave that be. Okay, so Stuart Crowe, who is, I've spotted up this morning, Health and Safety Risk Manager of the University, is that correct? Are you still that? What do you call?
Head of Risk and Assurance.
Head of Risk and Assurance. There you go, you see, you're learning all sorts of useful phrases. Briefly, Stuart, first of all, just explain what your job is here at the university, and then explain your background, why you actually know a bit about this subject.
Okay, so I'm the Head of Risk and Assurance for Facilities, Residential, Commercial Services. So our departments look after the capital projects, maintenance activities, cleaning, all the support services basically for the university. So all the big capital projects we've got on site, our departments look at design, build, maintenance and demolition, a whole life cycle of a construction project. And we've got what you will do in a couple of years based on our teams, and I work very closely with our design team, our in-house design team and project managers as we look to design buildings, build them, maintain them, and then eventually demolish them as well. So that's a little bit about me. I've worked in this industry now for 17 years. I've worked in the railway industry, doing a very similar thing across track and civils, and then I've come here to do a thing in where we got around health, safety and risk in the construction industry and the maintenance.
Okay, that's great. So obviously Stuart is an expert. So you'll come across people like Stuart, either within university organisations or occasionally architects employ experts to help them when it's a particularly tricky project. So he's not a designer, he's coming at it very much from the specialist point of view. So the first question is, what are the do's and don'ts for designers?
The do's and don'ts, I think the most important thing to take away really, if you can possibly get involved at stage 0 and 1, you're going to have the most impact and most influence in the design stage. If you get involved in a project, probably stage 2, 3 and 4, you're getting there to be a little bit too late to have the influence and impact. So that's a real important thing. Trying to get involved in a project at stage 0, stage 1 is ideal to get involved. Really what you should be doing is building a great relationship with the client and principal contractor, and we'll come on to that in a bit more detail as why we do that as we look at some other questions. You need to consider health in design. That's a big thing when you're looking at design and the construction phase plan, the construction phase, how you're building in health within the construction phase, the elements of it. You've got to consider designing out risk, but you need to be realistic about this. And I think Peter was touching on this as I walked in. It's about cost-free risk. It'd be great to design every risk out, but that's not reasonably practicable to do. So we've got to look at that balance of cost-free risk. What's the benefit? You really need to consider that and challenge yourselves when you're considering that. You need to assist the client at building pre-construction information. It's really important to build that relationship with the client and principal contractor, because you can influence how they design, how they construct. You've got a real impact there. you need to really consider about maintenance, cleaning, the whole life cycle of the building. It's not just about your design, it's about how can we build it, how can we maintain it, and how can we demolish it or alter it. They're really important. Having an understanding of modern and traditional construction techniques is a really good tool to have. So you understand how construction works, how things are put together. That will really help your design stage. Understand your strengths and weaknesses in design as well. You're not going to be an expert in everything. Understand when you need to get assistance from other designers in your team, and that will really, really help and emphasise what you do. Have an understanding of a wider breadth of health and safety legislation. Peter's touched on it briefly about the Health and Safety at Work Act, but the health, safety, welfare regulations, also the building regulations. That'll help you build a bit better picture of how you design safer buildings. What you shouldn't do is allow clients to take shortcuts to allow sufficient time and fund it. Value engineer without reason. This is a real problem, value engineering, because it has an impact later down the line on maintenance. Don't allow your architectural flair to compromise the health and safety, the build, the maintenance of the activity. Don't make any assumptions, find out what's really happening. So that's a quick snapshot of some really key do's and don'ts when you're thinking about designing.
Okay, so there's two things there. One is communications, which we've talked about, and the other is the client. And sometimes, of course, you have to hold the client's hand because you might be the expert, and that might be the first time they've ever dealt with a job. So I've already talked to the students about a scenario on a building site where something went wrong. And you might think, it's nothing to do with me, construction site. But can you just give a little tip about thinking about layout of the construction site early days and how that might impact on the safety of the operation?
This is why it's so important to get involved at the very early stage of design and getting a really good relationship with the client and with the principal contractor, because you can influence the principal contractor and what happens on site through your design activity. So you can put in design about site cabins, storage of material, welfare facilities, traffic management, not just inside but around the site as well. So how the vehicles come in and to and around the site. Also fire safety. So what you do and what you design while you work with the principal contractor can really affect these. So some real examples of this. So the position of a building on site can facilitate safe egress and access, so vehicles don't have to reverse. So if you go to our Greenbank site, our new halls of residence are building our new student village. We spent a lot of time on our traffic management plan. So vehicles come in one way, unload or pick up, and they never have to reverse. And that takes some design and some thought. And that removes a significant risk of large vehicles reversing around site. Also space for delivery and storage of equipment. Again, if you've got adequate space, a dedicated location to store equipment, it removes risk, removes fire load as well. So through the design stage, we can remove many hazards through prefabrication. So we can do a lot of things off-site and then bring them to site. So we're removing the risk of people working and fabricating on-site, and you've got these risks in a dedicated manufacturing site where it's designed to do these activities. So when we're actually designing, we're looking at the build as well, not just the layout, but designing the installation of floors, stairs, parameter walls to follow closely behind when you start to erect primary structures, removes the need for temporary access, and reduce the need for edge protection, which reduces the need for the risk of falling. So you can see how the impact of how you design the layout of the site really impacts.
Okay.
Is that okay?
That's great, Stuart. Thank you. So now, it's very likely that you will be the leader of the design team. The architect normally fulfills that role. Even if you're not project manager, you're very often design team lead. So I'm curious to know, Stuart, from your perspective, how that design team leader's role can impact on the health and safety side.
So this is, you probably take the role of a principal designer under the CDM regulations, what Peter's referring to there. there's two types of roles for the designer, a designer and a principal designer, and we'll talk about the principal designer. So really, this is a really, really key role in the whole construction phase. The role is really to ensure safety is embedded into the design process, the site layout, build, maintenance, alterations and demolition. But it's really, communication here is absolute key. So you're there to facilitate communication between the client, between the designers and the principal contractor. So you're a conduit of information, and that's really, really key to take away from this today, that communication element is really essential. So we've talked about building a relationship with the client, making them understand their duties. So I'm going to look at this in two stages, the principal designer role and how this is important. So pre-construction phase, so you need to really ensure coordination between designers to ensure they've considered the whole risk, the whole life cycle of the project, construction, maintenance, cleaning, demolition. Your role as well is to oversee the design. So even though you might not be an expert in every particular area, you need to challenge what's been put in front of you. And that's really important, that constructive challenge. And pick out high risk areas. And the way you should do this is you should attend design team meetings. So what are people putting in front of you? And what doesn't look quite right? And ask you the question, why have they put that design? Could have we done a safer way? Could have we done a better way? It's really key to challenge that and coordinate. So we need to make sure all the designers are following that same principle, and you're bringing the designers in all together at once, rather than doing their own thing. It doesn't have any benefit. At this stage as well, it's also important to bring a principal contractor in, if possible. Sometimes the principal contractor is not appointed at this stage. If they are, bring them in. We can ask them then, how does this look on site? How do we build this? How does this look? Helps to engage with us as well. If the principal contractor is not involved at this stage, and you've got, to the university, we've got a framework, so we'll bring in our framework principal contractors in the design stage to talk about the logistics on site and how the design is affecting the logistics on site. If you can't do that, then go out to the industry to see if someone can come in to support you do that. But that's a really, really good point, really good tip to take away. We also need to get some information about the pre-construction as well, so gathering information there at that stage. The construction phase, your job's not finished when the construction phase starts on site. You need to be there to coordinate information. Continue to liaise with the principal contractor. There's potential for design to change during the construction phase. You need to be involved there to review this design change and how it impacts on the construction and the whole bit of project. And you also need to gather information about your health and safety file, so when the next project comes along, people have already got this information to help them start their next project. And also a good tip is take any lessons learned. You'll learn, the more you do this, the more you'll learn. So make notes of what you've learned as you've gone along. But the big key thing for this is communication and getting the right people in the room together at once. So your client is so important, your principal contract is important, and your designers. So it's having all the designers and you coordinating this information together. Because what you design here impacts on the construction site. That's why it's important to have your principal contractor present during these meetings. Okay?
Okay. So Stuart has responsibility across the university for other things, not just construction. He's also to do with how the buildings work after they're finished. And I'm interested to know if you can think of just one or two examples of things that have been done which then caused you health and safety difficulties in terms of maintenance and ongoing operational issues.
So we don't have to look very far for things like this. Don't even have to look further than the university. So the first question to you is, how do we maintain these lights? Ideally, they have a walkway from the top, so we could access the lights from the top and change the light bulbs. We don't. To change these lights, you have to scaffold out the whole atrium, the whole lecture theatre. And this is not just in this one. If you go to the one next door, which is probably 2 or 3 times the size, we have to do the same thing. If a panel falls off the ceiling, we have to get up and scaffold it. So you can see where that could have been better designed before we do this. You can create walkways above, so you can go and access light, or there's other options to do that. So that's one example. We've got atrium glass in the university, and the only way to clean this glass is to shut the building down, scaffold the whole atrium, and then clean the windows. Now that's not ideal from an operational perspective. We've got fire dampers in our ductwork throughout buildings. When the ceilings goes in, we can't access the fire dampers. We've had to go back in and cut hatches in and do further work, alterations to the building to be able to go in to actively maintain the fire dampers. We have things like, when we do build and access hatches for like mechanical and electrical plants, then we stick equipment right underneath it. So we stick like lab benches in. That's a real common one at the university. We stick a lab bench but right below our access hatch, so we can't access what we need to access. A recent one, we do a lot of modular build, especially in halls of residence. If they come already built and they come in, great from a design perspective. Then we put plasterboard behind it. We can't access any of the valves. We can't maintain the showers, the toilets, because we've got plasterboard now. We put behind it for fire detection. So what we have to do now is take all the plasterboard away, do the maintenance, and then replace the plasterboard to keep that fire compartmentation. We've got high-rise windows that we can't access to replace them. So you may notice around the university where windows are cracked with films on. It's because we don't know how to get up to replace them and take them out due to the weight, due to the position. So these are just a handful of things really that we've identified over the place in our new builds, and it continues to happen. That we struggle with maintaining things and getting access to things. Access and egress is a real problem. How do we get access to do stuff to maintain this? But if you're involved in the project and designing things out, one thing we should be putting in our health and safety files is a good way of maintaining it. So the health and safety file should really tell us how to access lights, how to paint, repair, how to modify things, how to get things to maintain